Hi everyone, welcome. We are here together, Giacomo Biraghi.
Luca Ballarini.
We are co-founders and co-directors of Utopian Hours Festival, and this time, for the first time, we are actually reliving together some of the talks that we experienced during the festival. Of course, Giacomo, the festival is a live experience.
We are very thrilled to have all this crowd together of urban practitioners, young, new, fresh minds here in Turin. We are fully engaged in the preparation of the 2023 edition, but we wanted to give you some hints of what happened last year.
Exactly. For the first time, I mean, the request we had regarding some of the keynotes that we lived, of course, during the Utopian Hours 2022 editions was so huge in a way that we couldn't resist. So that's why we're here. We're going to introduce today and in the coming weeks some of the talks that were more, in a way, also anticipated and most followed by our crowd and people that were at the festival. So who we're going to start with tonight?
Of course, the first Utopian Hours talk will be from an architect, I would say a city maker, Amanda Burden. We had the pleasure to have her on stage, and she is the woman that, in a way, created the New York we all know now, with all these pedestrian path, the very well-known High Line, so a superstar.
She's actually, as we called her, the woman who changed New York City, and she liked this title, of course. And I think what was really important of her talk was also the tone of voice that she had, that really mesmerized most of the audience, because she was talking about how passionate we can be in, of course, city making, but also the idea that cities are a lively organism, and the more we delve deep into somehow its conscience and consciousness, and the more we are able to understand how to change it.
And I want to add that also Amanda, like a lot of other speakers in Utopian Hours, she is a sort of role model for our audience. We want really to create this community of Utopian Hourser, and she is for sure one of the source of inspiration for all of us.
It was for several years that we tried to have her on stage, so we were, of course, very thrilled by her presence, and so was, of course, the crowd and the audience. So we're going to start with this, and of course we're going to see you again in the next weeks with more talks from Utopian Hours. Thank you for being with us, and we'll be again together soon.
Ciao.
Thank you, Giacomo, and thank you, Luca. I'm so honored and delighted to be here as a part of Utopian Hours. And of course, just as Giacomo said, cities are about citizens, and that's what I'm going to talk to you for a while tonight. So first, let me start by saying, when people think about cities, they tend to think about buildings and streets and skyscrapers and noisy cabs. But when I think about cities, I think about people. Cities are fundamentally about people and citizens. And where people go and where people meet. So even more important than buildings in a city are the public spaces in between them. They are what makes a city work. But what is it about successful public spaces that draws people to them? And what is it about unsuccessful spaces that keeps people away? I thought if I could answer that question, I would make a huge contribution to my city. One of the more wonky things about me is that I'm an animal behaviorist. But I use those skills not to study animals, but to study people in cities and how they use public spaces. The first public space that I studied was a small vest pocket park in Midtown Manhattan, which you see here, called Paley Park. This little place had become a small phenomenon. And because it had such a profound effect on New Yorkers, it made an enormous impression on me. I studied it very early on in my career because it had been built by my stepfather. So I know that places like Paley Park do not happen by accident. But what was it about this space that made it so special and drew people to it? Well, first, there were the comfortable, movable chairs. People would come in, put their hands on the chair, move it a little, and then sit down and stay a while. And then people attracted more people. And it was green. So Paley Park gave New Yorkers what they crave: comfort and greenery. But my question was, why weren't there more places in the city with greenery and places to sit in the middle of the city where you didn't feel alone or like a trespasser? Well, that's not how cities were being designed. This is a familiar sight. This is how plazas have been designed for generations. They have that Spartan look we associate with modern architecture. But what would you do here? Where would you sit here? How would you feel here? But architects love them. They are plinths for their creations. And developers, well, there's nothing to water, nothing to maintain, and no unfortunate people to worry about. But don't you think this is a waste? I was hoping to be able to create public spaces that gave you the feeling that you got in Paley Park. But over the many years, I learned how difficult it is to create meaningful, enjoyable public spaces. And as I learned from my stepfather, they certainly do not happen by accident, especially in a city like New York. Public spaces have to be fought for to begin with, and then someone has to think very carefully and very hard about every detail. The first opportunity I had to fight for a great public space was on a gigantic landfill in Lower Manhattan on the Hudson River called Battery Park City. I was leading a team of planners there, and it was a problem because nobody wanted to build there, and for 2 decades it had lain completely fallow. So we had a kind of a radical idea. Why not build a really high-quality public open space first on the water and see if that made a difference? But that space, that 2-block section had to be perfect because eventually it would become a mile-long esplanade. So I insisted that we build a mock-up in wood at scale of the railing and the seawall and the pavers and put down a real bench and test to see how it worked. But when I sat down at that test bench, with sand still swirling all around me, the railing hit exactly at eye level, blocking my view and ruining the experience at the water's edge. So you see, details really matter. So as you design public spaces, think less about your design sense. Think about the user and tap into your humanity. All this became, and let me show, next slide. So this photograph may look very perfect to you, but those lights, the railing, the bench, the plantings and the trees, and the many different places to sit were all little battles that turned this project into a place that people wanted to be. All this became very valuable when Michael Bloomberg appointed me to be his planning commissioner and put me in charge of shaping the entire city of New York. Now, Mayor Bloomberg was elected only 7 weeks after the tragic events of 9/11. And he was determined to show New Yorkers and the world that New York was still a strong, resilient city and had a great future in front of it. Now, therefore, all of our projects were courageous and ambitious and economically strategic. You may not know that New York is actually an archipelago. It is made up of 5 boroughs. 1 of them is Manhattan, but 4 of them are islands. We have perhaps the longest waterfront in the United States at 520 miles. New York was originally an incredibly successful port city, and all along its harbor were lined with piers and shipping terminals. But as the shipping companies moved south, all of those piers were abandoned, and over the many years they deteriorated and became degraded, and the edge of the waterfront was very dangerous. This is a photograph taken in 2002 of the Brooklyn waterfront. Impossible to get to and impossible to use. So reclaiming the waterfront for public use became one of our most important priorities, and reconnecting New Yorkers to their waterfront for recreation, for respite, and for transportation. Our hope was that the water would once again be part of New York's core identity and part of New Yorkers' everyday lives. After all, our water is our greatest open space. The first waterfront park that we opened was in the neighborhood of Greenpoint and Williamsburg in Brooklyn. And this is exactly where that photograph that I just showed you was taken. I worked incredibly hard on every square inch of these plans. I wanted to make sure that there were tree-lined paths to the waterfront, that there were trees and plantings everywhere, and of course, lots of places to sit. Honestly, I didn't know how it would turn out, but then it opened and it was incredible. People came from all over the city to see this park. I know it changed the lives of the people who lived there, but it also changed New Yorkers' whole image of their city. I love coming down here and watching people get on this little ferry that now runs between the boroughs, and people are using it as if it had always been there. This is a park in Lower Manhattan. Now, Lower Manhattan's waterfront had been a mess even before 9/11. The 2 miles around the lower Manhattan was completely degraded. Wall Street was essentially landlocked because you could get nowhere near this edge. So we felt it would be critically important to recapture for the public Lower Manhattan's waterfront edge. And so people could have access to that edge, and we thought it would be incredibly important as part of the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan. And it was. Lower Manhattan now has a complete waterfront edge that all the public can get to. Now, I really love this park. The railings have to be higher now, so we created bar seating at the water's edge. And look how the railing flattens out and widens so you can put down your lunch or your laptop. And you can sit so close to the water, you're practically on it. And I love it when people look up and say, oh, there's Brooklyn, and it's so close. Now, for New Yorkers, that was amazing. Actually, I think it's sort of a miracle that now New Yorkers can relax at the water's edge, surrounded by nature. Water and nature are the ideal antidotes to the density and intensity of urban life. And when people can be surrounded by greenery and water, they tend to think differently about their city. Now I'm going to tell you about a very unusual park called the High Line. The High Line was an elevated railway that ran down the west side of Manhattan through 3 neighborhoods, bringing meat down to the markets on the west side. And when the train stopped running, this elevated trestle became a kind of a garden in the sky. Opportunistic plantings had turned it into a magical landscape. And when I first saw it, it was actually a 1.5 mile long meadow of wildflowers. And when I first went up on that old trestle and saw this for the first time, honestly, I fell madly in love. You can, I missed one slide. Oh, there it is. You can walk floating above the rooftops and seeing the city from a floating vantage point. Once you are on it, you are truly transported. It's kind of rough and delicate, beautiful and magical at the same time. Extending for 22 blocks, elevated above the street, you can walk from neighborhood to neighborhood without coming in contact with a single vehicle. I thought that this was an opportunity to knit together a large portion of Manhattan's West Side, with the High Line as the defining feature of a new neighborhood. But the neighborhood at that point, although it housed the gallery district, was also home to mostly auto repair shops and storage warehouses, and the High Line was considered a blight upon the neighborhood. In fact, it was slated for demolition, and Mayor Giuliani's last act was to sign a demolition order for the High Line. So when I was appointed, saving the High Line for demolition became my most important project and my first priority. And honestly, I felt if there was a day that I didn't worry about the High Line, it would come down. There were 38 powerful developers that lobbied for its demolition. And all people could see was this rusty old trestle. And so basically, how were you going to convince people to save something they could not see? Well, the founders of the High Line, Joshua David and Robert Hammond, had a brilliant idea. Why not hire a great photographer to take pictures of those wildflower meadows that people could not yet see and could not yet walk on? And they did that. They hired a photographer called Joel Meyerowitz. And those are the photographs that I just showed you were by Joel Meyerowitz. And those photographs were our most effective weapon. They rallied hundreds of thousands of passionate supporters to save the High Line. We raised the money. We didn't have the money before. We raised the money. We negotiated with the developers. We built local support in the community. And in 2004, the ownership of the High Line was transferred to New York City. We started construction in 2006. And in 2009, the first section of the High Line opened to international acclaim. The designers cleverly combined the old and the new, but kept that sense of otherworldliness and kind of exuberant landscape. They intertwined industrial infrastructure with abundant natural beauty. Now the High Line has become one of the most famous parks in the world. And each year, more than 8 million visitors come to visit it. Why? To be immersed in nature in the middle of the city. This is a magical experience, a sensory, physical experience. The genius behind the High Line is Pete Audoff, the landscape architect. Pete doesn't get the recognition, but he is the star of this show. Nothing in landscape architecture has come close to this work. I've often heard Pete be interviewed about the High Line, his palette, his aesthetics, why he chose certain plants over another. Pete replies modestly but directly. His design wasn't about aesthetics or a palette or about certain plants. His goal was to create a feeling. The High Line, he said, is about emotion. It is the emotion you feel when you are completely surrounded by nature, the emotion that is evoked by that feeling, the feeling of a sense of well-being when you are in nature, of well-being that nature can give. Well, our sense of well-being over the past 2 years has been shaken. The trauma of the pandemic has shifted what people are looking for in their public spaces. Citizens are now looking for more expansive spaces, greener spaces, not your traditional parklets and piazzas, but healthier, lusher spaces, spaces where you can get closer to nature. We are beginning to realize that immersive, deep immersive nature can have a healing effect on our physical well-being and our mental well-being. Perhaps during COVID, you felt an urge to find the healing power of nature. Perhaps you found time to take your time. Perhaps you noticed birds more or plants more, or even small beauty. Perhaps you felt a connection to something larger than yourself. Perhaps you felt a different emotion. Listen, we love our cities. We love the excitement, the interaction, the density, and the activity. But our cities have never been under greater stressors. The effects of climate change are affecting the existential existence of our cities. Extreme heat and drought, torrential rainfall, sea level rise, pollution of our air and our water. These are the pressing effects of the climate crisis. Green, immersive, intense nature has the ability to counter these stressors. It can give, as much as we need nature as individuals, cities need what nature can provide. It can contain our rainstorms. It can cool our streets. It can prevent drought and mitigate heat. And it can clean our air and our water. And we're not just talking about trees. We are talking about meadows and forests and streams and wetlands. Cities would be more beautiful. They would be cooler. They would be greener. And they would be resilient. Cities all over the world are beginning to bring expansive landscapes into their cityscapes. In Dubai, in China, in Thailand, in Singapore, you are seeing forests and wetlands and streams take the place of architecture and stone and piazzas. Well, you might say, this is too radical. This is a complete rethinking of how we shape cities. How can you possibly justify such an expense? But remember, during COVID, many people deserted cities for healthier, greener, calmer spaces. And that is a calamity for cities. Cities thrive on people. They need people economically and socially. So when cities are going to begin to compete in the world for people, because people, after all, now can choose because of technology, remote work, and because of their mobility. They can choose which cities best serve their needs, which cities best address their sense of well-being. So cities are maybe going to have to radically adjust their spending priorities. Immersive, green, deep nature may be their most worthwhile expenditure and their best asset. Now, how would you feel about a city where you could spend time in nature within a city? Isn't this a city that you would return to? Isn't this a city that you would stay in? This is a new way of shaping cities of the future. Cities entwined in nature, deep nature in the city for the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow.
You're welcome.
So, Amanda, I start with a question, but if you have questions from the ground, we take 2 questions from you, so prepare. We had Robert Hammond here on the stage, I think 3 years ago. 2 years ago?
Year.
Last year, okay. Time passed so, okay, in the trilogy. And he said that one key factor of the success of Highline, in his mind, was the fact that the core team, including him, wasn't expert on landscape architecture, on how to create green spaces. So they had a sort of open mind on this.
But they had the feeling that...
Yeah, they have a strong feeling. There's a vision, not a technical expertise. Exactly. How do you comment on this being so involved into this project?
I think in the beginning, I think about any public space or a great space, the first thing one has to do is immerse yourself in it. What is its DNA that's really working? And if you think about that, when we went up on the High Line, those pictures, its DNA was about 2 things. Its DNA was about the plants, and it was about the industrial infrastructure. And whatever proposals, and there was a big competition that Robert led, whatever proposals capitalized on those 2 things, the industrial infrastructure and the plantings, was what was going to work. So you didn't have to be an expert. You had to find the architects and the designers who would bring those 2 things to the fore. And that was our objective and challenge. So all you had to see was the proposals by the architects, Liz Stiller and Rick Scafidigo, and Pete Audoff to say, that's the one. They captured the essence of the High Line. So we were the facilitators and the choosers, but they were the ones who gave us what we knew, because it's about feeling, as Pete said, we knew would give that feeling again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda, when we met the first time in New York, I remember that you told me, that you can really get to know a place or admit that you know a place when you've been around the neighborhood for so many times, and that's something that I really remember. So, in your work as chief of the Department of Planning, you were all around the place, and you supervised like more than 100 transformation of New York.
Yeah, we created master plans, developed master plans for 124 neighborhoods. Wow. That was block by block, lot by lot, the height the buildings could be, and we knew we were going to grow by 9 million people, so where were we going to grow? And the idea, we have a very good mass transit system, public transit, subway, so if you could grow near public transit, nobody would need a car in those buildings. So that was the idea. But each neighborhood has its own character and feeling and scale, and it was very important to preserve that while we grew.
Yeah, so 2 hints from Amanda. Listen to your feelings and walk a lot in the city. So that's
Good, yes.
you should, as a expert and as a
Questions from the audience?
Any
If we have,
question?
one
Up
there.
there, one Scott and one there. Let's start from the
Okay,
guy
fantastic.
there, and then we get Scott.
Yeah, just we're talking about a utopia. So what's your a kind of utopia that you can put on in the city? You talk about green, but it's not like a utopia anymore. So what's thinking about the future? What can be an utopian thing that we can think about in a city?
What's next?
He's
Amanda?
asking,
next?
he's asking to be more visionary. In a
More
way.
than green. What's next?
Okay, well, the first thing is we don't have green in cities, so we have to get there. We have the idea of showing you the slides of green, and then maybe I'll get to something after that, but is that people can't imagine a city with that kind of intense green. So I want to keep showing these slides so people get in their heads that they can actually imagine a really dense green city. Because if you imagine it, then you will demand it, and then it will happen. But after green, okay, now after green, you know, I think we know that we have a lot of problems in cities. So the biggest problem is climate change in cities and housing in cities. So we have these two issues. It's not what comes next, but we have to address our crises. And then you have to want to keep people in cities, so you have to make healthy, livable cities. We know that. But we have many crises going on right now, and we should attend to them. And nature can attend to many of them in very important ways.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott, he will speak soon
Tomorrow.
tomorrow.
Scott Francisco from Montreal and actually also from New York.
Thanks so much. I actually have 2 little boys, and we spend a lot of time in Montreal right now looking for places to get those boys on hands-on. And a lot of the spaces you showed, which are incredibly beautiful, feel a bit hands-off. In other words, you're sort of on a walkway and don't touch the plants, maybe, which is an experience we sometimes have. So I'm wondering if one of the next phases is to get more contact, like, you know, you can sort of do some digging and maybe some hands-on activities, and maybe there's some spaces that you've been working on that have
Like in
that.
museum, that before it was don't touch, now it's please touch.
No, definitely. And I think, you know, COVID had many tragic events, but I do believe that it did make people want to be close to nature, touching nature. And I think there are many iterations of that. I mean, it could be with more, you know, botanic gardens, but I think it's also with urban agriculture and people planting in community gardens. And I think that all of that builds community, but it also brings people very close to grow what we eat. And I think it's a very important idea. So thank you for that question.
Last question from the ground. We had on the stage Lend-Lease a few hours ago. Please.
Thank you very much. I mean, you are an inspirational person, and thank you very much for your presentation. Just one question, because you were the chief of planning, so a pretty high position. But how did you build the consent around you, you know, in the municipality, to make sure all these kind of initiatives were grounded?
Okay, so it's hard with a microphone. Can you say exactly
How
did
you
I feel?
build up the consensus around you.
Oh, around with the people, not
Yeah.
not with the government, with the citizens.
And the municipalities and the government.
Ah,
Yeah.
well, the most important part.
That's another lecture.
With the
The
government,
people, she was most reassured.
with the government is more difficult. But I spent, you know, almost every night of my job with people in their communities. One, I love doing that, but everything that we did had to be passed by a city council, and so it had to be approved by the communities. But the communities were the one who know, don't build here because there's a school for the blind here. No, 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 this can take more height. So it was each one of these, they were called rezonings, but it was, you know, remapping legally what you could build. Took 3 years, and maybe 100 meetings, maybe more than that, to actually build consensus around the future of each one of these neighborhoods. Now, convincing government it's a little more difficult. So the way it's structured is, and I think you have deputy mayors here too. You have the mayor, and then you have a deputy mayors.
We have a lot of deputy mayors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had a very strong deputy mayor who was incredibly ambitious, incredibly demanding, and at every hearing he would make all of the departments come to the hearings so that the people could say, take care of what needs to happen. So I think the best way is a very strong and demanding deputy mayor actually makes government work much better.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.